The next thing that we need to consider when we're identifying recruits is how to create a resourcing plan or a sourcing plan, as it says here on the slide. And the next 3 slides gives you a good idea about how to go about doing that and the steps involved in that. Remember, when you are developing your staffing plan, you start with strategy. Then you need to incorporate your planning and job analysis issues. And then once we've determined what employees we need, how many we need, and what the gap looks like, whether we have a surplus or a deficit, then we create a sourcing plan to identify the candidates that we want to hire to fill those gaps. So in terms of creating the sourcing plan, we want to profile desirable employees to identify promising sources. So oftentimes organizations will go, I could use 3 people like Jim. Well, where did you find Jim? Where did you find access to his resume? How did he apply for the job with you? What resource did he go through in order to be able to find a job with your company? So once you figure that out in your current company, then you can come up with a plan to figure out where to find them. So identify the desirable talents and successful current employees that are in similar targeted jobs. Then you can use surveys or focus groups to figure out how to reach those people. What kind of websites do they go to? What newspapers do they read? What radio stations do they listen to? What internet sites do they surf? All those things. And once you get that information, that starts to give you a good idea about how to find similar employees in similar locations. So the next step in creating your sourcing plan is to figure out, using certain sources, how do you figure out the effectiveness? So where your applicants discover your vacancies? Where do top candidates discover vacancies? How many recruits does each source generate? And you should have this information in your human resource information system or in an ongoing record that you keep separately. We want to know how many applicants did we get from a certain source and how many of them were successful, how many of them got us to a successful outcome in the end. So these are all the yield ratios that we've talked about. These are all the important metrics that we've talked about in previous classes. You want to look at promotion rates. You want to look at absentee and turnover rates, all broken down by source, because you should have access to that information, where people came from, et cetera, and break it down by source from there. This slide is a really effective tool to use. It's table 6.5 in your textbook, chapter 6. And it's the recruiting source effectiveness analysis. And so this gives you a good idea of the kind of data you need to collect in order to be able to do your metric analysis. Number 1, in the left-hand column, we have all the sources that we use: college hiring, employee referrals, career sites, search firms, walk-ins, newspaper ads. The next column is how long it takes us. What's the cycle that it takes us from recruiting to hire to get candidates and to be able to hire them. So college hiring takes longer, as we've talked about, but walk-ins are very quick, because typically if someone walks in, drops off a resume, you identify them and you put them through the process pretty quickly. Cost per hire, obviously the cheapest cost per hire is the walk-in, and the most expensive is search firms. So we don't use search firms for lower level jobs, even lower level managerial or supervisory jobs. We use them for upper level jobs. C-suite, maybe the next layer below that, directors or advanced directors, because the cost for search firms is very expensive, so we want to be careful about that. In terms of the new hire quality, walk-ins are usually okay. They're not the best, they're not bad, they're not the worst either. Actually, the place to get your worst candidates nowadays is newspaper ads. It's usually people who don't have access to other sources, so they get newspapers and they glean the want ads and the employment ads in the newspaper, and they apply for jobs that way. And again, think about it this way: most people will search the internet. So if you are in a situation where you're low skilled, low employed, not making a lot of money, you don't have access to the internet, you're unlikely to use internet resources, and you use what's available and the cheapest to you. And so it may be that these people have less skills. It doesn't mean they're not good hard workers, but they have lower level skills. They can't come in and do a lot of jobs, perhaps. So something to consider. The very good quality candidates obviously comes from college hiring, because we usually build a relationship with a particular college where we are doing our recruiting, and we know how to assess college students for high quality work. Referrals are also good quality work, as long as we are careful to not use that as our only source, because referrals can get us a problem with homogeneity and not a lot of diversity. Career sites are okay. Search firms are also okay. So these are all different sources that you can use, and these are the criteria that you should be considering. We've talked about metrics in Management 430. We continue to talk about metrics in 431. And here's an example of some key recruiting metrics: time to fill, cost to recruit, and annual salary. So we look at applicant A. You have 2 new people for the same job in the position. Which hiring process was the most effective? For person A, it took them 3 months to fill the position, so it was fairly quick. The cost to recruit was $6,500, and the annual salary was $97,000 that you're going to be paying this person. And that may have to do with how you negotiated, et cetera, et cetera. Person B, it took 5 months to fill, to find somebody for that position. It cost you over $12,000 to recruit that individual, all the costs involved in the recruitment and selection process. And then their annual salary was $103,000. It's possible, given that it took you 5 months to find somebody to fill that job, that you ended up having to pay more to lure somebody or to attract somebody to take the job. So if you were to look at which one was the most effective, probably the most effective one was the source for person A, because it was a fairly quick turnover, there was a lower cost, and you got a reasonable negotiated salary with that individual that made it more cost effective for you. So now the goal, of course, would be to look at how good of an employee they were, because even if person A came from a more effective source, it still doesn't mean that they're the best candidate. The next thing that we would need to investigate is, are they a good employee on the job? Do they last more than 6 months on the job? What their performance appraisals are, and then what's the return on investment for them. If they are a really good performer, then we would have a higher ROI with person A than person B. So now, taking this idea of the metrics a step further, we compared person A to person B. We believed that person A, it was a more effective hire, and a more efficient hire, rather, because it took 3 months, was lower cost, and a greater annual salary. A smaller annual salary, sorry. In terms of the first year revenue that this person had a direct impact on their productivity rate, their first year revenue was $330,000. Their second year revenue was $352,000. And they left the company in 26 months. So that means just a little over 2 years on the job, they ended up leaving after they finished their second year there. Would that be a person that would be considered high potential? Absolutely not, because they did cost us less. Their annual salary was lower, but what they generated as compared to person B was lower revenues, and they left the company. So now I have to go and return to the recruiting process to rehire somebody to fill that position. So person B had a slightly higher salary, slightly more expensive cost to recruit, a little bit longer time to fill, but their first and second year revenues were significantly higher than the other person, and they didn't leave the company. They're very happy with the company. And so we would consider them a high potential employee, ready for advancement in the company. If they have the desire to, they are doing a really good job for us, and they're worthwhile for us. So even though it looked like person A may have been the better choice because it cost less, in the end, it really was person B, because when you pay a little bit more money to get the better candidate, you will end up with better productivity, better revenues, better outcomes, and a lower likelihood that the individual is going to leave the company. So don't always be fooled that if you just cut the costs, and keep the costs as low as possible, you'll get the best candidate ever, and that's not true. And particularly for this sort of position at the $100,000 and above level, you're starting to talk now about skill sets that are really important that you're going to have to pay for. So certainly for higher level positions, it doesn't hurt to spend a little bit more money to get that much better of a candidate. And as you can see, the difference between $330,000 revenue in the first year for A and $442,000 for person B, that's a big difference. And then it almost comes close to doubling. It's probably like 3/4, of the difference added on top of 352,000. And so the bump increase from year 1 to year 2 for person A wasn't that significant, but the bump from year 1 to year 2 for person B was huge. So again, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Don't assume you can just cut your costs as low as possible and find the best candidate. That's not a great option for hiring for important positions where turnover can be very costly. The third point to consider when creating a sourcing plan is to prioritize your recruiting sources based on your staffing goals. And so what you do is determine what all your staffing goals are going to be, as we did in slide number 2, figuring out what metrics are the most important to us. And again, those metrics will be very different depending on the kind of company you are, what level position you're recruiting for. So be clear what metrics would be important for a lower level, mid-level, and upper level position. They're going to be very different. From there, prioritize those sources based on the staffing goals and the results of your effectiveness analysis. Basically, looking at which sources were the best for you. If quality is the most important thing, college hiring is the preferred source. If hiring speed is most important, then employee referrals would be given priority over that. So going back to slide 3, keep that in mind in terms of the different tools that you can use for hiring. The last thing that we need to consider is sourcing non-traditional applicants. This is always controversial for organizations because many of them try to think outside of the box about where to find non-traditional applicants. And here's a couple of things. Number one, workers with disabilities. While they are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are still considered non-traditional applicants because of the stigma or the presumption that someone with a disability is not going to be able to do the work the same as somebody who is quote-unquote able-bodied. This is a fallacy. And we know this from research, but nonetheless, we still have to overcome our own biases and our own stigmatized perceptions of stigma rather, about what we expect from people with disabilities. All right. So it's always important to keep in mind that you can go to vocational rehab areas, you can go to the government, you can even go to military, people transitioning out of the military. There are agencies that you can register with to be able to find workers who may have disabilities, or even workers who simply maybe served in the military previously and are now transitioning to civilian work. Older workers, again, also subject to bias. Why? Because everybody assumes, and those of you that are young, in your 20s, all carry this bias by and large, that once workers get old, they don't want to work hard anymore, or they're not interested in learning things, or they're going to leave the company sooner than later. And this is against the law, because the Age Discrimination in Employment Act tells us that we're not supposed to discriminate against people because they're older, over 40. But also, you are making an assumption about what that person will or won't do on the job. I'm 55. The last thing I have any interest in doing is, leaving my company, leaving SIUE. I don't anticipate retiring anytime soon. So if someone were to say to me, well, you're 55, you're close to retirement age, I'm really not. And I anticipate working for a long period of time. To also assume that older workers are not savvy, that they don't want to learn new things, that's also a fallacy, because many older workers know how to learn effectively. They have been learning effectively throughout their life. And that's not to say there aren't lazy workers who are older workers. There are plenty of lazy people at all ages, right, that are just entrenched. They don't want to learn new things. They're done with whatever they've learned. They don't want to go any further. But older workers are not necessarily unlikely or unwilling to learn new things, particularly computer and technology related things. Welfare to work also faces another stigma. People assume that because people are on welfare that they're not interested in working, that they're lazy. That's not true. People who are on welfare don't want to be on welfare. Most people really do want to get out and support themselves and have good income and insurance and all the benefits that go along with having a permanent full-time job. So if you are looking for a non-traditional way to get someone with different skills going to the welfare to work pool, and state employment agencies are usually good sources for this, you want to be able to identify people who you think want to return to the workforce and they don't want to stay unemployed. These are people that are going to be really loyal to you and grateful for the opportunity. Another source you could consider that's not listed on here are returning prisoners, people who have had to serve prison time and are now trying to re-enter the workforce after they serve their time. They may be on parole, but nonetheless, they need job opportunities. And if you're familiar with a company called Dave's Killer Bread, that's what Dave does. Dave has a bread company in which I think he just sold off. But traditionally what he does is he hires people who were in prison and are looking for job opportunities. So he gives them an opportunity to work, to build up their resume, to show that they can do good hard work, that they're not going to return back to their life of crime. And those are really great resources for people who want to work hard and want to prove themselves. Global sourcing is also really important for us, and we need to think about where are we going to find our employees, and also what tactics or strategies do we want to take to think about our global sourcing. As I know you've probably covered in Management 330, and to some extent we've covered in 430, Management 430, this idea of integration versus differentiation. Do we want to integrate and have a single global staffing strategy where we hold the same standards or the same goals and expectations across all of our global locations, and we retain control over local operations, and particularly in terms of hiring? That's a tight, integrated system. There are some pluses and minuses to that. On the plus side, we can control it. On the minus side, the locals might resent it. And so it also shows that we don't trust the locals to be able to make good decisions for themselves. And also, again, every country is different, every culture is different, and so if we have a sort of an integrated staffing strategy, we don't really take into account the nuances and differences between countries. A differentiation approach to global sourcing is that where we respect and acknowledge the local diversities, the local cultures, and we really allow for local people to be able to make their own strategic decisions about hiring and the kinds of people that can benefit from a job in our company, and vice versa, that we can benefit from hiring. Local employment agencies are very useful to help you with sourcing your local labor market. So if you are now going to be conducting a search in a global location that's not your home country, it helps to start working with your local employment agencies to learn more about um, how to get the candidates, how to get them pre-screened, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing to consider in terms of sourcing is geographic targeting. And basically, we source recruits based on where they live, and that helps us to focus on the local labor market. And it can also help us to focus on locations where the size of the city or the cost of living, the climate, the recreational opportunities might be similar to what we do. So we could extend and we could recruit in locations that are similar to us. We can also target individuals that are likely to find the firm's location attractive. So if we are in a warm climate, we might want to recruit people who live up north who don't want to live in a cold climate. Vice versa, you might, if you're in a cool climate, you might be thinking about other places where people might appreciate continuing to work in a cool climate. So different ways to think about it. So sourcing is important, a sourcing plan is important, and it's the first step actually it's the second step after forecasting of what we need to do to figure out how we're going to identify applicants, get those applicants in here, and then ultimately be able to screen them, select them, and hire them for the job.